Hello, my name is Wyatt Stevens,
My name is Shivani Murgapran.
and we did a project on From Stocks to Stimulus, analyzing COVID-19's economic and mental health fallout. The main purpose and interest of this project was to discuss market performance, government intervention, and mental health outcomes. For the market performance, we looked specifically at the S&P 500 and how it did throughout these economical challenges. The government intervention, we looked at the stimulus checks, and we looked at cost of living because these were two main things that you could balance and you could get an idea of what the values meant. And then for mental health, we looked at an estimate of suicide rates across America. For the data collection process, I did the suicide CSV, which I found from data.gov, and I did a suicide estimate starting from 2019 going through 2021.
I did the S&P 500 API, which I pulled from Alpha Vantage Stock APIs, which has APIs from local companies all the way to market trends. And then I did the stimulus round check CSVs, which were 3 rounds for 3 different CSVs, officially from the IRS website. And finally, I did the cost of living web scrape. And me and Wyatt had 4 to 5 different iterations of that, looking at everything from mental health to unemployment and government filings. And we ultimately landed upon the cost of living, which was accessible and from a reputed source.
For the data cleaning of the CSV, this one had a couple major difficulties with the date time function, which I had to learn. But through that, I was able to make some major changes, changing it from a day, month, year to a year, month, so it could be correlated to the other graphs that we had, and we could really do something with these values. And the second main thing was I had to do one or two major one-liners to clear and clean all this code that were a little bit above the peer review, but I learned a lot through doing this.
Awesome. And for me, I started off with the S&P 500 API and kind of put this into 2 different steps. For the first one, I created a dictionary called Market Dict, and I parsed through this data to create the header list and also to just clean up the daily data in itself. From there, we parsed through that, the years list, and all the sub dictionaries within the API to create a new dictionary that holds the monthly averages that were calculated after parsing through this original cleaned dictionary. And so here we removed trailing characters, rounded monthly averages, and reformatted dates to get what you see here. Next, we have the cost of living web scrape. So to do this, we began by identifying and listing out in a list all the different states. And then we went through to the table in itself. We found the table and we extracted the needed columns associated with each state. And finally, for the stimulus check CSVs, we used regex to clean each of them and to take the numbers that were formatted with commas and make them usable floats. And so here we had 2 things that we extracted from each CSV, the number of payments from that round and the amount that was distributed in that round per state. And that kind of brings us to the expectations that we had. So firstly, we expected that the market and economy, so the S&P 500 would decrease during the recession and the cost of living would increase. We also estimated and hypothesized that stimulus check issuance would be correlated with S&P 500 growth and increase the cost of living. And finally, we hypothesized that a decrease in suicide rate would occur as the stimulus checks were distributed, and there would be a correlation between that and the S&P 500 performance. That brings us to our analysis and insights. For our first visualization, we looked at a violin plot to illustrate the distributions of each of the rounds of stimulus checks. So if you hover over it, we get all the different statistical data from maximum to median and minimum. If you hover over each of the dots, you get the amount that was given each round to each state. From here, we kind of assumed that now California will have the highest amount across all rounds, indicating its significant share of disbursements. And then we assumed and we concluded that round 2 of stimulus check had the lowest variability, while round 3 had the highest, expressing the standardized approach and eligibility criteria to the distribution process itself.
To speak on visualization two, what we did here was we created two line graphs, one with the S&P 500 monthly averages, and compared that to the monthly averages of suicide across every state. What we were trying to do here was see if positive and negative spikes had a correlation from the economy to the society. And as you can see here, looking following January 2020, right at February 2020, when the recession started, there's that major negative spike in the S&P 500. And what you can also see is a very positive spike, which is a very sad spike in the state-by-state suicide rates. And as you can see, even as the market is trying to recover, there's still plenty more spikes occurring, and that they are incurring at every trough that occurs in the market, showing that there is a correlation between these two values. And then for visualization 3, I made a chloropeth graph, which is where you look at a body and then you build out from there. So I use the United States as a whole because that's where our data is obviously covering. And then I use the same gradient scale for all of them. So that way they could be comparative from 2019, 2020, and 2021. And as we can see, as the years go on, going up to 2021, there is a decrease. And what that kind of shows us is that there is a fall off after the recession has ended and that society is getting back to a normal. Now this might be a little bit harder to see if you're looking at that Midwest area, just because a lot of that already has very low rates. But if you look specifically at Texas, Florida, California, all the other major centers of society where there's high populations, very known for economic centers, there's a large darkening of those, which means that suicide rates are actively falling in these areas.
And that brings us to our insights. So for insight number one, we wanted to identify whether or not the amount that was provided in each of the stimulus checks affected the cost of living in each state today. So we mapped those total amounts by the cost of living index to see if there was a correlation. We did find that there was a minimal association. We ran a regression to see if this was tracking and if it is statistically significant. And we came to the conclusion after importing statsmodels.api to run the regression that there are other confounding variables that are in play here that we need to look at before we can make a one-to-one correlation. And insight two, we divided our data into 4 time periods: before the first round of stimulus checks, between the first 2 rounds, between the last 2 rounds, and the long-term effect. So after March 2021 to today. And what we did was we mapped each of these periods against the monthly S&P 500 market closes to identify the impact of those stimulus checks. So the long-term impact was virtually nothing, as the index stabilized post 2021 until present day. However, between the first 2 rounds, that number fell a little bit before increasing significantly between the last 2 rounds of stimulus checks.
And then to speak on insight 3 that we came to from this graph was we looked at the monthly data of suicide rates across America. And this was to further explain what that previous visualization showed, but on a national level. And what we can see is that there's very high spikes, especially in that February date. And to give a little bit of a quantitative calculation that goes along with that, is that there's a roughly 1,000 higher suicide rate in the month of February compared to January and March, meaning that this value did play a very big role and that there must have been a major shock in society for this to occur. And then just talk on insight 4, which was to get this average suicide rate data for the years in across America and compare that to the cost of living. And then from here, we were able to see that there is a minimal correlation, not a very strong one either. But what we did see was that if you're looking at certain spikes, such as the high cost of living areas, which are also where there is a higher population, there is a much stronger correlation. And this is a very intuitive data, which makes a lot of sense with what we've been talking about, which is that where economic centers are, there is a very high effect.
Well, that brings us to our final insight, which is insight 5. And what we did here was we looked at 3 different time periods. One was February 2019, so exactly a year before the onset of the recession, February 2020 when the recession began, and April 2020 when the recession ended. And here we looked at suicide rates by state. And what we concluded was when the recession began, consistently across all states, the suicide rate increased. However, by the time the recession came to an end, the suicide rates had returned to pre-recession levels, showing that society and individuals were able to bounce back after some of the economic shocks and also the cultural shocks that came from the COVID-19 pandemic. And that brings us to our final results and analysis. So again, we looked at 3 main ideas: the market performance, the effect of government intervention on economics of local people, and overall mental health and resilience. And so what we learned here is the S&P 500 had a steady increase after their post-recession dip, and it bounced back over time, and now is continually growing. Furthermore, we found that there was a minimal association between cost of living and stimulus check amounts. However, there was a decent association between the S&P 500 and the 3 rounds of stimulus checks. And finally, we concluded that because of this, the suicide rate did briefly increase at the start, but it then returned to normal levels, showing that overall the United States has been resilient economically and in our mental health in the face of a recession. Thank you so much.
Thank you.